My name is Jacob. I've always been a wrestler. I say always. When I say that, I mean ever since I was born, even before I was born. To let you know a little bit about my family, my grandfather was 100 years old when my father was born. For many years, my grandma, Sarah, could not have children. And it took a miracle from God for her to finally have my father, Isaac. And she was 90 years old when he was born. It was like that with my mother, too. She couldn't have children for years. She and Dad tried for 20 years. But she couldn't have children. And finally, they prayed, and finally, God answered their prayers. And I was the answer to their prayers. Well, me and my brother Esau, actually. We're twins. I told you I've always been a wrestler. They say that while we were still in the womb, we were bouncing off the walls, wrestling and fighting with each other. Can you imagine that? When Mom got to where she couldn't take it anymore, she went to the Lord and said, "What's going on?" And the Lord said, "2 nations are in your womb." And Mom said, "Well, I can certainly believe that." "And 2 peoples from within you shall be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." This was a prophecy from God about Esau and me. Even before we were born, God said the older will serve the younger. Well, Esau was firstborn, but they say I came out wrestling him for it. When I came out, I grabbed him by the heel, trying to take his place as the firstborn. I've always been a wrestler. And from day one, Esau and I were as different as night and day. He's a man of the field, a backwoodsman, a hunter. He likes the wide open spaces, nothing tying him down. That's the kind of guy he is. He's a manly man. He's transparent, says what's on his mind. You never have to wonder what he's thinking. He's tough. He's rugged. He's independent. He's adventurous. And he's also hairy like a monkey. But his big problem is he has absolutely no patience. He doesn't see the big picture. He's impulsive. He always lives in the moment. But people are drawn to a man like that. I'm just the opposite. I stay around the house and do my work quietly. I try to stay focused, and I'm always thinking and planning and observing and waiting for just the right opportunity. Some people may say I'm calculating. You also need to know this about my family. Esau has always been Dad's favorite. But Mom loves me the most. A little bit more about Esau and me. One day, we were young men. He came in from the field. He was hungry. He thought he was starving to death. You know how that goes. And he's one of those guys who lives by the philosophy, if you don't hunt and kill, you don't eat. Well, I happened to have a pot of stew cooking right at that time, and he said, "I'm begging you, give me some of that food to eat." I saw this as an advantage that I could leverage. He was hungry, and I had food. So I said, "Sure, you can have a bowl of my stew, but it's going to cost you something. Sell me your birthright for the stew." Now, there are advantages to being the firstborn son. The birthright gives a son leadership, a status of leadership in the family, and double the inheritance from the other children. And I wanted it all. I knew he'd throw away his birthright to fill his belly. So I made him swear to me, and he did. He is a slave, was a slave, to the here and now. How foolish it is to choose something that is so fleeting, like a bowl of soup. He gobbled it down, and it's satisfied his hunger for a little while, but do you know that just a few hours later, he was hungry again? He threw something away that was so precious that would last a lifetime. But I had wrestled it away from him. But he didn't put up much of a fight. Years later, when Dad was old and blind, he called Esau into his room and said, "Son, I'm not going to be around this earth much longer. It's time for me to give you my blessing. And so here's what I want you to do. Go out and hunt some wild game and prepare my favorite meal for me. Bring it in to me, and after I've eaten, I will give you my blessing." So Esau went out hunting. But Mom was eavesdropping on their conversation, and she ran straight to me and she said, "This is what your father's going to do. We've got to act quickly." And so she came up with this plan. While Esau was out hunting, I was going to go get a couple of goats and bring them in, and she would cook the food, and I would take them in and present them to Dad, pretending to be Esau. That way I could get his blessing. And I said, "Mom, that's not going to work. He'll know I'm not Esau. And if he finds out that I'm trying to trick him, he will curse me instead of blessing me." But she had it all worked out. She put Esau's clothes on me and took the skins of the goats that I had killed and put them on my arms and on my neck so that in case Dad touched me, I would feel like Esau. So she gave me the food and sent me in to steal my brother's blessing. And her plan worked just perfectly. Now, Dad was suspicious. In fact, he kept asking, are you really Esau? But the food was more powerful than any of his reservations. And I lied. I deceived him. I fooled him. And he blessed me instead of Esau. And it was a good thing because Esau came in just a few minutes later, and he was excited this was going to be the biggest day of his life. But he had only been in with Dad for a minute or two when I heard "No, Dad, please bless me too." And then the crying went on and on and on. He knew immediately who had been in the room just before him. And he was angry. And he said, "Isn't that little skunk Jacob rightly named?" My name Jacob means deceiver, trickster. The birthright was already mine, and now I had my father's blessing. I had wrestled it away from Esau. Well, Esau never liked me much, but now he hated my guts. And the one goal in his life was to kill me as soon as Dad died. That was his plan. So I knew I had to get out of there. Mom said, "You've got to leave. Your brother's going to kill you. Why don't you go and see my family back in Haran? I have a brother there named Laban. You can stay with him for a while, and then when things settle down, I'll let you know, and you can come back home, and everything will be fine. While you're there, why don't you look for a wife? That would be a good thing." So I left home. I left the land of Canaan all alone. I had nothing but my shepherd's staff in my hand. That first night, I lay down to sleep under the stars. All I had was a rock for a pillow. And I had a dream that night. I dreamed about a ladder that reached from earth to heaven, and angels were going up and down that ladder. And the Lord spoke to me, and He said to me that He was the God of my grandfather Abraham and my father Isaac. And He promised to give me the land that I was lying on. I didn't even have a bed to lay on. He also promised that he would make me a great nation. I didn't even have a wife. And as I lay there, God promised me that he would be with me, and he would protect me, and he would never leave me. At that very moment when I had absolutely nothing and deserved even less, God promised me everything. The truth is, I'd never really thought much about God, but I called the name of that place where I was sleeping that night. I called the name of the place Bethel, which means the house of God. And I made a vow to God. Here's what I said. God, if God would be with me, and if God would feed me and clothe me, and if God brought me back home safely, then he would be my God. I know it's pretty demanding and self-centered. I realize that. But soon, for the first time in my life, I was outside the land of Canaan, wandering toward Haran. And when I was getting close, I ran into some shepherds and I asked them, hey, do you know my uncle Laban? And they said, yes, we know him. In fact, there's his daughter right there coming with the sheep. I saw her, and they were coming to the well, and so I drew water for all of her sheep and watered all of her sheep. And then I ran to her and greeted her and told her who I was, and I cried out loud. I was so glad to see somebody that was related to me. I told her who I was, and immediately she ran and told her dad. Well, Uncle Laban heard what happened. He ran out to the well to meet me and invited me to go home with him. I stayed there for a month, just kind of helping them work here and there. And finally, one day he said, you know what? You're my relative. You shouldn't work for me for nothing. Name your wages and I will pay you. Well, I knew what I wanted. I wanted Rachel. Uncle Laban had 2 daughters. Rachel was the younger. She was beautiful. And Leah, the firstborn, not so much. So I told him, I tell you what, Uncle Laban, I'll work for you for 7 years if you will give me Rachel as my wife. And he said, well, it'd be better that I give her to you than any other man. So yes, we've got a deal. And those 7 years seemed like just a few days because I loved Rachel so much. Every day that I worked, Rachel was on my mind. I couldn't wait for the day. And finally, our big day came, our wedding day, the greatest day. We celebrated all day long. And when evening came, Uncle Laban gave me his daughter. She was clothed in her beautiful wedding gown and had her beautiful veil covering her beautiful face. And we spent our first night together. And when the sun came up the next morning, I rolled over, and there was Leah. I couldn't believe it. I had worked for 7 years for the fox and woke up with the dog. Of course, I ran straight to Laban and said, hey, what's going on here? What's the deal? We had a deal here, and that ain't it. Why have you deceived me? The deceiver had become the deceived. Laban gave me some lame excuse about not marrying the younger daughter before the older daughter. It wasn't their custom. Well, I had lied and schemed to become the firstborn in my family, and now I was stuck with the firstborn in his family. Well, Uncle Laban and I worked out another deal. Well, some people may call this poetic justice, right? We worked out another deal, and he gave me Rachel, and I worked another 7 years. Can you imagine 2 sisters married to the same man? And Leah always knew that I loved Rachel more. With my dad, I knew how that felt. Like my grandmother Sarah and my mother Rebecca, Rachel was not able to have children. What are the chances? But Leah didn't have a problem. She had 7 children, 6 boys and a girl, and Rachel had none. And then I had 4 other sons by the handmaids of my wives. And finally, God was gracious to Rachel and me, and she had a son, and we named him Joseph. And I had never seen such a boy. He was absolutely the apple of my eye. So here I am. I've got 12 children, 11 boys and a girl, a big family, but I have no possessions. My work with Laban's cattle and sheep had made him a wealthy man, but I really didn't have much to speak of. And I told him, it's time for me and my family to go. I've spent enough time building your fortune. Now I need to get out and build mine. But he begged me to stay. And again, we made another deal about his flocks. And out of his flocks, I would take all the striped and spotted and weird colored animals. I said, that'll be fine. That will be my wages. And you know, that very night, his sons stole all the striped and spotted and weird colored animals and took them away. Well, in spite of that, over the years, I became quite a wealthy man. I had flocks and herds and servants and camels and donkeys and all of those things. I now had the finances that I needed to support a family like mine. And the Lord came to me in a dream and he said, it's time for you to go back home and I will be with you. Back to Canaan, I will go with you. So I told my wives, and they all agreed, and so we snuck away while Laban wasn't watching. I had all my possessions, all my children, and we were all headed toward home to the land of Canaan. It was 3 days before Laban realized we were gone. And he chased us for 7 days before he caught up with us. And when he caught up with us, he was angry. But God appeared to him in a dream and said, Laban, you better be careful how you treat Jacob. You're treading on thin ice. When he finally did catch up with us, it was ugly. And we had quite a controversy. I'll tell you about it some other time. We had some harsh words, but we finally made peace with each other and agreed to go our separate ways. He kissed his daughters and his grandchildren goodbye, and then he left. And we headed on toward Canaan. I had been gone from home for 20 years. Both my parents had died while I was gone, and I hadn't seen or heard from my brother Esau. But I had not forgotten how I left and why I left in such a hurry. And I was sure he hadn't either. Who could forget what I did? Well, as we got closer to Esau's home, I have never been so scared. What would he do if he got his hands on me? You know, how was he going to treat me? But we had to go on. I had to face my brother. So I sent gifts ahead to him. I wanted him to know that I wanted peace. And I learned from my servants that Esau was coming to meet me. Not alone, but with 400 men. I was scared. My knees were knocking, and I devised a plan and divided my family into 2 groups. And I thought, well, if he attacks this group, the other one will escape. If he attacks that group, this one will escape. After my plan, I did something that was very uncharacteristic for me. I prayed. And listen, it was a desperate prayer. And I said, Lord, you have been good to me. I left here with nothing, and now I have this large family and all of these possessions. I know I'm not worthy of it. And Lord, my brother is out here, and I'm afraid of him. I don't know what he's going to do to me. I'm afraid he's going to kill us all. Lord, remember You said that you would make me a great nation. And Lord, I desperately need you now. Well, I schemed and I prayed and I schemed some more, and I sent servants ahead to Esau with gifts, waves of gifts, goats and rams and camels and all of those things. And I told them that you be sure to tell Esau, I want peace. I'm not looking for trouble. These are my gifts to you. That night, I sent my family across the little stream Jabbok. And I stayed behind just like I had 20 years earlier, all alone under the night sky, and it was dark. But in the darkness, a shadowy figure jumped me, and we wrestled. This time, we wrestled all night long. I wrestled until daybreak. I wrestled with God. Have you ever wrestled with God? The truth is, that night summed up my entire life. I had spent my entire life wrestling with my brother, with my father, with my father-in-law, with myself. But that night I realized that all of my struggles had really been struggles against God. And as I wrestled with him that night, I was determined not to give in. But in one moment, he reached down and touched my thigh. And just like that, I was crippled. And all I could do from there was hang on. Then he said, let me go, for the day has broken. And I said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. That night I came to face with God. I also came face to face with myself. Then he asked me my name. I had to admit it. My name is Jacob. I'm a cheater, a deceiver, a supplanter. That's what my name means. And I came to know myself that night for the very first time. But he also changed my name. He said to me, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And I named that place where we wrestled Peniel. That means the face of God. Because I had seen God's face and found grace and not condemnation and not death. And then he blessed me as the sun rose. Well, I came out of that night with two things. I came with a terrible limp that has lasted me the rest of my life. And it constantly reminds me of my weakness and how fragile I am and how frail I am before God. But the other thing I came away with was a new name. Israel, which means he who struggles with God. I certainly didn't overpower God that night. In fact, I only survived by giving in to him, by surrendering to him. And my name, Israel, always reminds me today that I only win when I yield to God. I finally understood that my victory, my blessing, was not to be won in wrestling, but in resting in what God had promised me. As the day dawned, my meeting with Esau was at hand. So I faced the day having no rest for the night and now limping. And I looked up and there was Esau in the distance with his 400 men. And as we drew closer, I put my family behind me. And I went ahead to face Esau, limping as I walked and bowing down 7 times on my way there. And as he closed in on me, he began to run. And I thought, oh no, what is he going to do? Is he going to kill me? But that was not his intention at all. In fact, he fell on my neck and hugged me, and we wept together and cried. The last time I had heard Esau's voice, he was weeping because I had stolen his blessing. And now he was weeping because his cheater, deceiver, lying brother had come back home. All I can say is that God had gone before me to soften his heart. That had to be it. And I found forgiveness in the heart that once longed to see me dead. I was finally back home in Canaan with my family and with all of God's blessings surrounding me. That first night away from home 20 years ago, God promised me that he would bring me back to the land. And I promised, if he brought me back safely, he would be my God. Let's pray. In Genesis 33, verses 18 and 20, Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel, which means God is the mighty God of Israel. Now, there is a theological word that is used to describe an Old Testament appearance of Christ. That is Christophany. I believe that the one who wrestled Jacob that night was Jesus Christ himself. A Christophany. And let me tell you this. You may have been wrestling with the Lord for some time. He may have been calling you to give your life to him. He may have been calling you to start following Jesus now. But you're fighting. You're wrestling. You're resisting his call. Why don't you make today the day that you surrender yourself to him? Would you do that? Yield yourself to Jesus Christ and let him be your Lord and Master. Listen, Jesus loves you and he stands with arms wide open waiting for you to come to him. He offers grace and forgiveness and mercy and a place to belong. I invite you to receive those things today. You may feel like you're a lost cause like Jacob did. You may think that there's no hope to salvage anything in your life and that you're doomed to wrestle and struggle and suffer and never claw your way out. But I assure you that Jesus is the mighty God of Israel. And just as he was the mighty God of Israel in Jacob's day, he is the mighty God of Israel today and will be the mighty God in your heart if you let him. You may be a Christian who has wrestled and struggled against obeying God's will and his leading in your life, but today you realize that this is the day I need to fully surrender my life to him. Whatever Christ is calling you to do, I invite you to come and surrender to him at the altar today. And wrestle no more. Would you come? I invite you to come as we stand. Richie leads us in a song.